The first encounter. Sheriff Hank Douglas adjusted his hat as he leaned back in his patrol car, the leather seat creaking beneath his weight. The soft hum of the engine was the only sound cutting through the silence of the small rural town of Greenfield. The clock on the dashboard ticked past midnight, signaling another quiet night of patrolling empty streets. Greenfield wasn't the kind of town that saw much excitement. Most folks turned in by 9 p.m., leaving the roads empty and the air still. For Hank, these patrols had become a ritual, a solitary routine that felt as lifeless as the streets he guarded. His once unshakable sense of purpose had dimmed over the years, especially after the death of his wife, Sarah. At 58, he often found himself wondering if the job he had dedicated his life to truly made a difference. As his patrol car rolled past the gas station on Pine Street, something unusual caught his eye. Under the harsh fluorescent glow, a small figure sat on the curb near the convenience store entrance. Hank slowed the car, his brow furrowing. It wasn't often you saw someone out this late, let alone a child. He parked the car and stepped out, the crunch of gravel under his boots breaking the stillness. As he approached, he noticed the figure more clearly, a young girl, no older than 12 or 13. She was curled up on the curb, her knees hugged tightly to her chest. Her hoodie, worn and too thin for the cold night air, was speckled with dirt. Her sneakers were scuffed, the soles nearly worn through. "Evening, young lady," Hank called out, keeping his voice gentle so as not to startle her. The girl's head shot up, her dark curls bouncing slightly. Her wide brown eyes met his, and for a moment, Hank saw a flash of fear before her expression hardened into guarded defiance. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Hank raised his hands slightly, palms outward, a gesture of peace. "Easy there. Just wondering why a kid like you is out here alone this time of night." "I'm fine," she said quickly, her gaze darting away. Hank studied her for a moment, noticing the faint tremble in her hands and the way she shifted uncomfortably on the curb. "What's your name?" She hesitated before muttering, "Mia." "Well, Mia, it's not safe for you to be out here all by yourself. Shouldn't you be home?" "I'm waiting for someone," she replied, her tone clipped. Hank frowned but didn't push. Instead, he crouched down a few feet away, careful not to invade her space. "Mind if I wait with you for a bit? It's part of my job to make sure everyone around here is okay." Mia didn't respond, but she didn't tell him to leave either. Taking her silence as permission, Hank leaned back on his heels, his eyes scanning the dimly lit gas station parking lot. "You hungry?" he asked after a few moments. Mia glanced at him warily, her stomach betraying her with a faint growl. Hank smiled and reached into his patrol car, pulling out a wrapped sandwich from his lunch bag. He held it out to her. "Here. It's turkey and cheese. Not much, but it's fresh." Mia eyed the sandwich suspiciously before snatching it from his hand. She unwrapped it slowly and took a small bite, her shoulders relaxing slightly as she chewed. Hank leaned against his car, watching her eat. "You live around here, Mia?" She didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Sometimes." Hank's heart sank at the implication. He'd seen too many kids slip through the cracks of the system, lost and forgotten in a world that seemed too big and too uncaring. He wanted to ask more, but he knew better than to press her. Trust took time, and he wasn't about to scare her off. "Well," he said after a while, "if you ever need anything, I'm usually around. Just look for the guy in the hat driving the big OL patrol car." Mia gave a small nod, her eyes focused on the sandwich in her hands. As Hank drove away that night, his mind lingered on the girl by the gas station. There was something about her, something vulnerable yet resilient, that tugged at his heart. He resolved to check on her again, just to make sure she was all right. Little did he know, that brief encounter would set off a chain of events that would change both their lives forever. a pattern emerges. The next night, Sheriff Hank Douglas drove his usual patrol route, the town of Greenfield blanketed in a quiet stillness. The streets were dark, save for the occasional glow of porch lights and the flickering neon signs of small businesses long closed for the evening. He'd been patrolling these roads for over 3 decades, but tonight, his thoughts were on the girl from the gas station, Mia. There was something about her that gnawed at him. Kids didn't just sit out by gas stations at night without a reason. He couldn't shake the image of her thin frame huddled under that worn hoodie, her eyes filled with defiance and fear. As he approached the gas station again, his headlights swept over the familiar curb. Sure enough, there she was, sitting in the same spot as the night before. This time, she wasn't just sitting idly. She had a sketchbook balanced on her knees, a pencil moving rapidly across the page. Hank pulled into the lot, parking a little farther away so as not to spook her. He grabbed a thermos of coffee and a spare sandwich from his car before making his way toward her. "Evening, Mia," he greeted, keeping his tone light. Mia looked up, her expression briefly surprised before she masked it with indifference. "You again?" "Me again," he confirmed with a smile, settling down on the curb a few feet away. "What are you drawing?" She hesitated, clearly debating whether to show him. Finally, she tilted the sketchbook just enough for him to see. The page was filled with intricate pencil strokes forming the outline of a towering tree, its branches twisting and reaching toward an unseen sky. "That's mighty impressive," Hank said sincerely. "You got some real talent there." Mia shrugged, but Hank caught the faintest hint of pride in her eyes. "You always hang out here?" he asked casually. "Sometimes," she muttered, focusing back on her drawing. Hank sipped his coffee, letting the silence stretch between them. He knew better than to push too hard. Kids like Mia were like wild animals, skittish and wary. Trust had to be earned, not demanded. After a while, he said, "You eat yet?" Mia shook her head. Hank handed her the sandwich, which she accepted without argument this time. She unwrapped it slowly and took a bite, chewing thoughtfully. "You know," Hank began, "there's a whole town out there with warm beds and hot meals. Why here?" Mia's chewing slowed, and for a moment, Hank thought she might open up. But then she shook her head again. "I just like it here, okay?" Hank frowned but decided not to press. "Fair enough. Just seems to me like there might be better spots to hang out, is all." As they sat in silence, a car pulled into the gas station. The driver, a middle-aged man with a scruffy beard, stumbled out, clearly intoxicated. Hank's instincts kicked in immediately. He stood up, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. "Stay here," he told Mia firmly. The man staggered toward the convenience store, fumbling with his wallet. Hank intercepted him near the door. "Evening, sir," Hank said politely but firmly. "You all right there?" The man squinted at him, swaying slightly. "I'm fine," he slurred. "Just need some smokes." "How about we call it a night?" Hank suggested. "Don't think you're in any condition to be driving." The man grumbled but didn't argue. Hank watched as he stumbled back to his car and drove off, hopefully straight home. When Hank returned to the curb, Mia was watching him with a curious expression. "You a superhero or something?" she asked, her tone teasing but with a hint of genuine curiosity. "Nah," Hank said with a chuckle. "Just a guy trying to keep folks safe." Mia's gaze lingered on him, her defenses lowering ever so slightly. "Must be boring around here, huh?" "Nothing ever happens." "Sometimes boring's a blessing," Hank said. "But not always." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. As Hank stood to leave, he said, "You need a ride somewhere?" "No," Mia said quickly. "All right. But listen, you see that house 2 blocks down with the green shutters? That's my place. You ever need anything, you knock on that door, you hear?" Mia didn't respond, but Hank saw the acknowledgement in her eyes. As he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Mia's story than she was letting on. He resolved to keep an eye on her, whether she liked it or not. The following nights confirmed his suspicions. Mia was there every evening, like clockwork, sketchbook in hand. She never asked for anything, but Hank made it a habit to bring her something warm, hot cocoa, a blanket, or a simple sandwich. Each night, their conversations grew a little longer, a little more personal. Mia spoke about her love for drawing and how it helped her escape from stuff. Hank didn't pry, but he listened carefully, filing away every little detail. One night, after she had finished her sandwich, Mia looked up at him and said, "You're not like most cops." "How's that?" Hank asked. "You actually care," she said simply. Hank's heart ached at the weight of those words. He didn't know what Mia had been through, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let her face it alone. As he drove away that night, the stars shimmering above the quiet town, Hank made a silent promise to himself. He would find out what was keeping Mia at that gas station night after night. And he would do everything in his power to help her, no matter what it took. The heartbreaking truth. The cold wind bit through the quiet streets of Greenfield as Sheriff Hank Douglas leaned against his patrol car, sipping from his thermos of lukewarm coffee. His breath hung in the air like a ghostly mist. Across the street, Mia sat on her usual curb by the gas station, sketchbook balanced on her knees, pencil moving in steady strokes. It had been nearly a week since Hank first found her here, and despite his nightly visits, the girl remained a mystery. She spoke sparingly, revealing just enough to satisfy surface-level questions. But Hank had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize when someone was hiding something. Tonight, he decided it was time to dig a little deeper. "Mia," he called as he approached, "you ever think about picking a warmer spot to hang out? Winter's just getting started." She glanced up briefly, her expression neutral. "I'm fine." "You always say that." "Maybe because it's true," she shot back, her tone sharper than usual. Hank sighed and crouched down beside her, his knees protesting the movement. "Look, I ain't here to hassle you. But I care about folks in this town, and that includes you. Can you at least help me understand why you're always out here?" Mia's pencil paused mid-stroke. For a moment, it seemed like she might brush him off again. But then she exhaled heavily, setting the sketchbook aside. "You really want to know?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "I wouldn't be asking if I didn't." Mia pulled her knees to her chest, staring down at the cracked pavement. "My mom died last year. Cancer." Hank's chest tightened. "I'm sorry, Mia. That's a hard thing for anyone to go through." "She was all I had," Mia continued, her voice steady but brittle. "After she passed, they put me in foster care. Bounced me around a few places. Some were okay. Others." She trailed off, her expression darkening. Hank didn't need her to finish the sentence. He'd heard enough stories about the foster system to fill a book, some good, most not. "So now you're out here on your own?" he asked gently. Mia nodded. "The shelter's always full, and I'm not going back to another foster home. I'd rather be out here." Hank's heart ached at the resilience in her voice. No kid should have to make that kind of choice. "You got any family left? Anyone I can call?" She shook her head. "Mom never talked about my dad. Said he wasn't worth mentioning. And if there's anyone else, I don't know about them." Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken pain. "Mia, you can't keep living like this," Hank said softly. "It's dangerous. And cold." "I'm used to it," she said with a shrug. "That don't make it right." Mia looked at him then, her brown eyes fierce. "Why do you care, Sheriff? Most people don't." Hank met her gaze steadily. Because I've seen what happens when nobody cares. And I ain't about to let that happen to you. Mia's expression softened, the tough exterior cracking just a little. I'll tell you what, Hank said after a moment. How about you let me drive you to the diner up the road? Get you a hot meal, no strings attached. Mia hesitated, clearly torn. But the mention of food seemed to sway her. Okay, she agreed reluctantly. A meal and a revelation. The diner was nearly empty when they walked in, the scent of fried food and fresh coffee hanging in the warm air. Betty, the owner, greeted Hank with a smile. Well, if it isn't Sheriff Douglas. What brings you in this late? Just grabbing a bite with my new friend here, Hank said, nodding toward Mia. Betty's eyes softened. Well, you're in luck. Kitchen's still open. Sit wherever you like. They slid into a booth near the window, and Betty brought over menus. Mia's eyes widened as she scanned the options. Order whatever you want, Hank told her. Really? Really? Mia settled on a cheeseburger with fries and a milkshake. Hank stuck with coffee and a slice of pie. As they waited for their food, Mia fidgeted with a sugar packet. You ever lose someone? She asked suddenly. Hank's throat tightened. Yeah. My wife, Sarah. 3 years ago. I'm sorry, Mia said softly. Thanks. It ain't easy, but you learn to carry it. Mia nodded thoughtfully. Mom always said I was strong. But sometimes I don't feel like it. That's all right. Being strong doesn't mean you don't hurt, Hank said gently. It just means you keep going even when it hurts. Their food arrived, and for a while, they ate in comfortable silence. Hank watched as Mia devoured her burger, a hint of color returning to her face. You got a real talent with that sketchbook, he said, breaking the silence. Ever think about doing something with it? Mia shrugged. It's just a hobby. Maybe. But I've seen folks turn hobbies into something big. Mia's lips quirked into a faint smile. Maybe someday. A promise made. After they finished their meal, Hank paid the bill despite Mia's protests. Think of it as my treat, he said with a grin. As they walked back to his patrol car, Mia's steps slowed. Thanks for tonight, she said quietly. Anytime, Hank replied. But listen, Mia, you can't keep living like this. I'm gonna help you find a better way. Mia's expression hardened. I don't need saving. Maybe not, Hank agreed. But everyone needs a little help now and then. Mia didn't respond, but she didn't argue either. As he drove her back to the gas station, Hank made a silent vow. He wasn't going to let this girl slip through the cracks. She deserved a chance at a better life, and he was going to do everything in his power to make sure she got it. Little did he know, the road ahead would be filled with unexpected twists and revelations that would test them both in ways they never imagined. Secrets beneath the surface. The crisp night air swept through Greenfield as Sheriff Hank Douglas sat in his patrol car, hands resting on the steering wheel. His thoughts were tangled with questions about Mia. A young girl living on the streets by choice? It didn't sit right with him. There had to be more to the story than what she'd shared at the diner. Hank's gut told him to dig deeper. As much as he respected her independence, a kid like Mia shouldn't be fending for herself in a world that often chewed up the vulnerable and spat them out. If he was going to help her, he needed answers. He flipped open his notebook and jotted down a few leads. First on the list was the foster care system. If she had bounced around as much as she claimed, there would be a trail of paperwork. And if she had run away, someone should be looking for her, unless the system had already failed her, which wouldn't surprise him. With a heavy sigh, Hank put the car in gear and headed toward the county records office. A troubling discovery. The records office was dimly lit, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly. Hank greeted the night clerk, a young woman named Carla, who was sipping on a cup of coffee. "Sheriff," she said with a smile. "What brings you here this late?" "Need to pull some files on a foster kid," Hank said. "Name's Mia. About 13 years old. Might have been in the system the last couple of years." Carla's smile faded. "That's a tall order without more information, but I'll see what I can find." She tapped away at her keyboard, her brow furrowing as she navigated the database. After several minutes, she frowned. "Got something," she said slowly. "Mia Thompson. Entered the foster system a year ago after her mother passed. Placed in 3 different homes, but..." "But what?" Hank prompted. Carla leaned closer to the screen. "She was reported missing 6 months ago. No sightings, no contact. Case went cold. CPS closed her file due to a lack of resources." Hank's jaw tightened. "They just gave up on her?" "Unfortunately, it happens more than you'd think," Carla said grimly. "Poor kid probably slipped through the cracks." Hank thanked her and left the office, his mind racing. Mia had been on her own for 6 months, and nobody was looking for her. The system had failed her, just as he feared. A confrontation at the gas station. Later that night, Hank found Mia in her usual spot, sketchbook in hand. She looked up as he approached, her expression wary. "You're back," she said flatly. "Always am," Hank replied, settling onto the curb beside her. "We need to talk, Mia." Her pencil stilled. "About what?" "About how you've been missing from foster care for 6 months and nobody's come looking for you." Mia's face hardened. "I told you, I'm better off on my own. Maybe you think that now, but it ain't right for a kid to be out here alone. You deserve better." Mia's hands clenched into fists. "You don't know anything about it. Those homes were worse than being out here. At least here, I get to decide who I trust." Hank took a steadying breath. "I get it, Mia. Believe me, I do. But there's gotta be a better way." "There isn't," she snapped. Hank met her fierce gaze, his voice calm but firm. "Let me help you, Mia. We'll find a way together." Mia looked away, her shoulders tense. "Why do you care so much?" "Because I've seen too many people slip through the cracks," Hank said quietly. "And I ain't letting that happen to you." For a long moment, Mia said nothing. Then, her voice barely above a whisper, she said, "There's something I need to show you." The abandoned house. Mia led Hank through the back streets of Greenfield, her footsteps swift and sure. They walked in silence until they reached the edge of town, where an old, weathered house stood shrouded in shadows. The paint was peeling, and the windows were boarded up. "This is where I've been staying," Mia said, her voice hollow. Hank's chest tightened at the sight. The place was barely standing, let alone fit for living. "How long have you been here?" he asked. "Couple of months," she said. "It's quiet, and nobody bothers me." Hank stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking under his boots. The air was thick with dust and the faint scent of mildew. A tattered sleeping bag was spread out in one corner, surrounded by Mia's drawings scattered across the floor. "You've been living like this?" Hank asked, his voice thick with emotion. "It's better than foster care," Mia said defensively. Hank knelt beside her makeshift bed, picking up one of the drawings. It was a portrait of a woman, Mia's mother, he realized, based on the tenderness in the lines. "You're stronger than most grown folks I know," Hank said quietly. "But even the strongest people need help sometimes." Mia's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I don't want to go back, Hank. I can't." "You won't," Hank promised. "We'll figure this out together. I'll make sure you're safe." For the first time, Mia's defenses crumbled. She nodded, her small frame trembling. A new beginning. As they left the abandoned house, Hank knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But he also knew he wouldn't stop fighting for Mia. She deserved a chance at a life filled with warmth, stability, and hope. "We're gonna get through this, Mia," Hank said as they walked back toward his patrol car. "You promise?" "I promise." And Hank Douglas was a man who kept his promises. Fighting for Mia. Sheriff Hank Douglas sat at his kitchen table, the scent of fresh coffee wafting through the air. His eyes were fixed on the stack of papers spread before him, case files, legal forms, and notes scribbled in his rough handwriting. The dim light above flickered slightly, mirroring his restless mind. Mia was still asleep in the guest room down the hall, finally resting in a warm bed after months on the streets. Last night had been a turning point, but Hank knew it was just the beginning. He'd promised Mia he wouldn't let the system fail her again, but keeping that promise meant taking on a bureaucratic machine that had already written her off. And if there was one thing Hank hated, it was red tape that stood between doing what was right. He sipped his coffee, determination hardening in his chest. It was time to make some calls. The first battle. The County Child Services office was a sterile, soulless place filled with tired faces and endless paperwork. Hank's boots echoed on the tile floor as he approached the front desk. The receptionist barely looked up. "Do you have an appointment?" "Nope," Hank said, flashing his badge. "But I need to speak with someone about a foster case. Now." She sighed, clearly unimpressed. "Name of the case?" "Mia Thompson." Her fingers tapped the keyboard. After a moment, she frowned. Her file was closed months ago. "Well, it needs to be reopened," Hank said firmly. "That's not how it works, Sheriff." Hank leaned in slightly, his voice low and steady. "I'm not asking. I'm telling. Get me someone who can fix this, or I'll be back with a warrant to review every single case you've mishandled." The receptionist paled. One moment. Minutes later, Hank was ushered into a cluttered office where a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor waited. Her nameplate read Judith Harper, Regional Supervisor. "Sheriff Douglas," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "What can I do for you?" Hank remained standing. "I'm here about Mia Thompson. She's been living on the streets for 6 months because your office dropped the ball." Judith's expression didn't waver. Her case was closed due to a lack of leads. "We did everything we could." "Everything you could?" Hank scoffed. "She's a 13-year-old kid, not a lost wallet. You don't just give up." Judith sighed. "Sheriff, I understand your frustration, but resources are limited. We have dozens of cases." "I don't care about excuses," Hank interrupted. "I care about Mia. And I'm not leaving until we figure out a solution." Judith studied him for a long moment. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I want temporary custody," Hank said bluntly. "Until we can find a permanent solution that doesn't involve shoving her back into a broken system." Judith blinked, clearly taken aback. "You're serious?" "Dead serious." She leaned back in her chair, considering. "That's highly irregular. You'd need to go through the proper channels, background checks, home inspections, legal proceedings." "Then let's get started," Hank said firmly. A hard conversation. Later that evening, Hank sat across from Mia at the kitchen table. She toyed with her fork, pushing a piece of meatloaf around her plate. "You didn't have to cook," she said quietly. "Figured you deserved a home-cooked meal," Hank replied. Mia glanced around the cozy kitchen, her expression unreadable. "This place, it's nice. Thanks. Built it with my own 2 hands back in the day," Hank said with a hint of pride. Mia set down her fork. "So what happens now?" Hank took a deep breath. "I had a meeting with Child Services today. Told them I want temporary custody of you." Mia's eyes widened. Why would you do that? Because you deserve better than sleeping on a gas station curb, Hank said simply. But I'm just some kid you found on the street, she said, her voice wavering. Why do you care so much? Hank leaned forward, his gaze steady. Because I see a kid with more guts than most grown folks. And I care because I lost someone too, my wife, Sarah. Took me a long time to find a reason to get up in the morning after that. But you remind me that there's still good worth fighting for. Tears welled in Mia's eyes, but she blinked them away. Nobody's ever done something like this for me. Well, get used to it, Hank said with a gentle smile. You're stuck with me for a while. A visit to the past. Over the next few days, Hank and Mia settled into an uneasy rhythm. She was cautious, still holding on to years of learned distrust, but Hank was patient. One afternoon, he decided it was time to dig deeper into Mia's past, not just for legal reasons, but because he wanted to understand her better. Mind if we take a ride? He asked. Where to? Your old neighborhood. Mia stiffened. Why? Sometimes facing the past helps you move forward, Hank said gently. Reluctantly, she agreed. They drove in silence until they reached a modest, weathered house on the outskirts of town. The yard was overgrown, and the paint was peeling, but it was clear that love had once lived here. Mia's eyes glistened as she stepped out of the car. It looks smaller than I remember. Funny how that happens, Hank said. Mia walked up to the front porch, her fingers grazing the chipped wood railing. Mom used to sit here and drink her coffee, she said softly. She always said it was the best part of the day. Hank stood beside her, giving her space. She was everything to me, Mia continued. When she got sick, I promised I'd take care of her. But I couldn't. That wasn't your job, Mia, Hank said gently. You were just a kid. Tears spilled down her cheeks. I miss her so much. I know, Hank said, his voice thick with emotion. But she'd be proud of you. I know I am. Mia looked up at him, her expression raw but resolute. Thanks, Hank. For everything. Always, kid, he said, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. As they stood there on the porch, Hank knew this was just the beginning. There would be more battles to fight, more hurdles to overcome. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. A future worth fighting for. The courtroom was filled with the sterile hum of fluorescent lights and the faint rustle of papers. Sheriff Hank Douglas sat at the defendant's table, his broad shoulders squared, a determined gleam in his eyes. Beside him, Mia sat in a simple dress Hank had bought her for the occasion. Her hands fidgeted nervously in her lap, but her face remained composed, a reflection of the resilience she'd built over years of hardship. Across the room, a state attorney adjusted his tie, his expression impassive. Judith Harper from Child Services sat next to him, her lips pressed into a thin line. The judge, a stern-faced man with silver hair, tapped his gavel. This hearing is to determine the temporary custody of Mia Thompson by Sheriff Hank Douglas. Sheriff, you may begin. Hank stood, his voice steady. Your Honor, I'm here because the system failed Mia. She's been living on the streets for months after being shuffled through foster homes that did more harm than good. She deserves a stable, loving home, and I'm willing to provide that for her. The judge arched a brow. You're aware of the responsibilities involved in taking custody of a minor, Sheriff? Yes, sir, Hank said firmly. And I'm ready for them. The state attorney rose. Your Honor, while Sheriff Douglas's intentions may be noble, he's a single man nearing retirement with a dangerous job. Mia needs a guardian who can provide long-term stability, not someone whose career puts him at risk every day. Mia's voice cut through the tension. With all due respect, sir, I've seen more danger in foster care than I ever did riding along with Hank. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge's expression softened. "Mia, do you wish to say something?" She stood, her voice trembling but strong. "Hank's the only person who's ever fought for me. He didn't treat me like a case file or a problem to be solved. He treated me like family. And that's all I've ever wanted." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Mia. Sheriff, do you have anything to add?" Hank's jaw tightened. "I've spent my whole life upholding the law, Your Honor. But sometimes the law forgets about the people it's supposed to protect. Mia's been let down by this system too many times. I won't let it happen again." The courtroom fell into silence as the judge reviewed the case file. Finally, he spoke. "Given the circumstances and Mia's clear desire to remain with Sheriff Douglas, I'm granting temporary custody pending a 6-month review. Sheriff, I trust you'll continue to act in Mia's best interest." Hank's chest swelled with relief. "Thank you, Your Honor." A new chapter. The sun was setting as Hank and Mia drove back to his house, the golden light casting long shadows across the road. "You did good in there, kid," Hank said, glancing at her. "So did you," Mia replied with a small smile. As they pulled into the driveway, Mia looked at the modest house with new eyes. It wasn't just a place to crash anymore, it was home. Inside, Hank set his keys on the counter. "Got one more surprise for you," he said, leading her to the spare room. He opened the door to reveal a freshly painted room with a cozy bed, a desk, and shelves filled with art supplies. Mia's sketches had been framed and hung on the walls. Mia's eyes widened. "You did all this?" "Figured you deserved a space of your own," Hank said gruffly. Tears shimmered in Mia's eyes. "It's perfect." She hugged him tightly, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. A fight worth winning. The next few months were a whirlwind of adjustments and challenges. Hank balanced his duties as sheriff with parenting, navigating everything from school enrollments to late-night talks about Mia's nightmares. Mia thrived in her new environment. Her sketches became more vibrant, filled with hope and possibility. Hank even convinced the local community center to host an art exhibit featuring her work. The town rallied around them, embracing Mia as one of their own. Hank's colleagues at the station chipped in to help, and even Judith Harper came around, offering resources and support. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars, Mia spoke softly. "You kept your promise, Hank." "Damn right I did," he said with a smile. "I never thought I'd have this," she admitted. "You deserve it, kid. Always have." Mia looked up at the sky, her heart full. "Do you think Mom would be proud?" Hank's voice was gentle. "I know she would be. A bright future." 6 months later, they stood before the same judge. This time, the hearing was brief. "I've reviewed the case and the progress Mia has made under Sheriff Douglas's care," the judge said. "It's clear that this arrangement has been beneficial for both parties. Therefore, I'm granting full legal custody to Sheriff Douglas." Tears filled Mia's eyes as she hugged Hank tightly. "We did it," she whispered. "Yeah, we did," Hank said, his voice thick with emotion. As they walked out of the courthouse, the future stretched out before them, uncertain but filled with promise. Hank had found his purpose again, and Mia had found the family she'd always longed for. And together, they were unstoppable.